Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and we're going to talk about where is Gary Gygax's name on the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition books. All right, let's jump right into it. This is a pretty big, important topic. So, I had assumed that Gary Gygax's name was on every Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition book. I was 100% wrong, all right? Condor DM called this out, and another, at least one or two other of my commenters called this out as well. I appreciate it. Basically, I think one of the reasons why I thought Gary's name was in there is I spent like a long time last year, like several months last year, collecting all the Orange Spine Easleys, and his name are all over those books, right? And I really just thought that Gary Gygax's name was listed in every single Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition book. That is not the case. Okay, so first of all, I'm very adamant. I'm an intense, adamant person, and I tell you when I'm right, and I have to tell you when I'm wrong. I was 100% wrong about this. Gary Gygax's name is not on the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition books, and the farther we get away from 2014, I think it is listed somewhere among some of them, but the vast majority, you will not find Gary Gygax's name listed on any of the books, right? So before we go a step further, okay, let me define my stance, what I've been saying, and what this brings to light about my position. All right. So first of all, there's three worlds in D&D now. D&D now, D&D now. That's me. D&D 5e. All right. I think that nothing in the world carries Gary Gygax's legacy further, farther, better, faster, stronger than Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Nothing. Right. And then there's D&D then. That's all the people out there who are like, Scott, D&D 5e sucks. It's all about 1, 2, 3, and 4e. And mostly 1 and 2e, right? That's the D&D theners, right? And then there's the D&D nots. Those are the people who play games that are copies of D&D 1e and 2e primarily, and are not D&D, but desperately wish they were D&D not, right? And they're like, oh, and so D&D then and D&D notters, they say, Scott, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is destroying Gary Gygax's legacy. I'm saying it's carrying it, and nothing is doing a better job of carrying Gary Gygax's legacy than Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And D&D theners and D&D nodders are saying, oh, Scott, hey, Dungeons & Dragons, Gary Gygax's legacy really died with 1 and 2e, but you can keep his legacy alive by playing 1 and 2e. That's kind of what they're saying. And D&D nodders are like, well, our game isn't D&D at all, but it's we are calling it D&D. Isn't that good enough? No, it's not. But and we're all looking at each other going, what the heck? All right? Like, I'm looking at them going, you're gathered around a trash can fire, warming your hands and telling people to come join you. This isn't doing anything to honor Gary Gygax. And they're like, Scott, can't you see that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is just tearing apart with every book the legacy of Gary Gygax? And so we're looking at each other from across this fence, and we see things opposite, right? Now, one of the things is that I'm convicted to do is look at data and see what the reality is, right? Okay, so here's a new fact, right? Okay, Gary Gygax's name is not on the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition books, period. It's on a few of them, but at the macro level, if you're looking at the trend, he is not listed on the books, and increasingly is nowhere to be found. Okay, now, and I know this because I just did the math. By the way, I just did the math. And you can see the math below. In the doobly-doo, you'll see a little bit, you'll see just a nice little piece of reference that I created. I put every single Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition book that's printed from 2014 all the way to 2022, right? There are 33 Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition books that have been created. It took 2,780 days to create those 33 books, those 33 Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition books, okay? They are dropping a book every 84 days on average, okay? So they are very specifically seasonal, okay? There have been a few years where we had 3 books. There's a few years where we had 5 books, but generally, season change, you get a new D&D 5e book, okay? And most of those books do not have Gary Gygax's name, and the closer you are to now, the less likely you are to see his name listed anywhere on Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Does this help or hurt my position? It is absolutely evidence against my position, right? If Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition design team loved Gary Gygax, they would make sure his name was on every book, and it's not, right? So this is evidence against my position, okay? All right, so admitting that, right? Does it mean my position's wrong? No, absolutely not. There's a lot of complexity here, and this is one point of data, okay? Now, if his name isn't on there, why can't we just say D&D Theners and D&D Nodders are right, and this is so that they can scratch his name off of Dungeons & Dragons history forever, right? Gary Gygax, because they hate him. And that's exactly what every D&D, pretty much every D&D then and every D&D Nodder is saying, right? They're saying, hey, I don't play D&D Theners and D&D Nodders say it constantly in my comments. I don't play D&D 5e, I don't buy it, right? Because it doesn't honor Gary. Not because it doesn't. They have a million reasons, right? Like, and to me, Gary Gygax is important. There's not a lot. People are like, it's interesting. I think D&D Thens and D&D Nodders, what they really are like, please, please, please don't make me think that it's not 1984, right? Like, you're like, I think that's really where they're coming from. They're like, I had a good time with the game in 1984, and I don't want it to progress 1 inch past that time, and I want everybody to play like I was in junior high and high school in the 1980s, and that's what I really want, and I don't want anything to move past that, right? I think that's where they're coming from, okay? That's my take, right? It's not really about Gary Gygax for them. Dungeons & Dragons is about Gary Gygax for me. I think he's a polymath and a great American hero that established something unique and special and hit it, right? And that it's, in my humble opinion, he hit it. Like, what he did was so brilliant, he knew it would not be accepted in its time. And he was 100% right? Like, he didn't know, I don't think Gary Gygax knew the Satanic Panic was going to happen, but he knew there was going to be significant pushback. He didn't know the shape of it, but boy was he right, and there was massive pushback, right? And I think one of the reasons why he knew this is he was a major disruptor, right? Like, he was just, people talk about disruption today, right? Gary Gygax was a disruptor, right? There's no, like, in every aspect of his life, he was a massive disruptor, right? Like, in industries, personal relationships, like everything, he was a disruptor, right? And people who do great things, they're often problematic, right? And Gary Gygax had some problems, right? Like, there's no two ways about that. So why isn't Gary Gygax's name on there? I'm going to grant, right? There, no question, okay? Wizards of the Coast is a super woke, super liberal company that's literally on the left coast, right? Like, coming straight out of Seattle, which is one of the most, like, literally one of the most liberal spaces in all of America, right? There are people, no question, on the design team that want to forget Gary Gygax and rub his name out forever from Dungeons & Dragons, no question, right? But when I look at D&D 5th edition, they're doing such a great job of making sure D&D is safe and growing and protected, right? And you really can't do that because without upping Gary Gygax, because he's so fundamentally tied to the product. Gary Gygax and Dungeons & Dragons, in my opinion, those names are synonymous, okay? People know them to get, like, not everybody, a lot of new people don't know who Gary Gygax is, but anybody who goes past the surface level runs into Gary Gygax very quickly whenever they study Dungeons & Dragons, right? So there is one more reason why Gary Gygax's name could be being left off the books, other than trying to destroy him. And I'm going to grant, I think it's about 10 or 20% of the people in Wizards of the Coast absolutely have beef with Gary Gygax and would love to rip his name off the product forever. Now, there's 70 or 80% there who love Dungeons & Dragons. I think a portion of them, probably 30 or 40%, don't care who created it. They just want it to be like, they're like, oh, D&D, now I want this to, I love this game, I want it to grow, right? And I think there's a good percentage of the design team who are in that space. And then finally, there is there are other people on the design team who do love Dungeons and Dragons. I think like Chris Perkin, who love Gary Gygax, and I think there's a whole James Introcaso. He did some work on there, and there's just a ton of people. I think there's about another 50 or 60% who do love Gary Gygax. No two ways about it, because they love Dungeons and Dragons, right? And I don't think and the design team is not one cohesive like group. They have different people in there who have different opinions, right? So you have all that going on. So what is the other reason why Wizards of the Coast would take Gary's name off? Well, here's one of the kickers, man. Gary left in a huff, right? Gary was never fired. He left, right? And what was presented was that he was pretty torqued when he left, right? That he was upset with Lorraine Williams, right? So here's the issue. Right now, there's a battle for the legacy of Dungeons and Dragons, right? Wizards of the Coast would like to say Wizards of the Coast owns the legacy of Dungeons and Dragons, right? But as you can see, the Gygax family is like, oh, you talking about Dungeons and Dragons over there? Look at Gary Con. We're talking about Dungeons and Dragons too, and we're still part of the legacy. So there is an ownership aspect of why Wizards of the Coast would purposely leave Gary Gygax off of the list, right? Just from an ownership perspective, saying, hey, Dungeons and Dragons is Wizards of the Coast. And I think they want to keep it there was talk that they were trying to sell it, but I'm seeing more and more signs that is not the case, that they're not trying to sell Dungeons and Dragons. And so Wizards of the Coast may be trying to put their name on, we are Dungeons and Dragons, Wizards of the Coast, Dungeons and Dragons, right? And Gary is a threat to that, right? And there's no two ways about it. So it could be purely commercial reason that they're leaving it off. However, let me end this video saying this is evidence against my point, and I acknowledge it, right? I don't think it makes my point wrong, but it is evidence on the D&D then side and the D&D not side that Gary is not loved by the D&D design team, right? Now, the reason why I still have hope and why I don't believe that's correct is nothing in the world ups Gary more than D&D 5e. Like, I really look at D&D then and D&D notters, and I just see them standing over a fire trash can, warming their hands and going, we're having fun. And there's like 4 people over there, and they're looking over this blazing carnival of fun, with like neon, and people are screaming and eating fried foods and having so much fun. It's completely evident, right? And they're going, that's not fun. Because to me, D&D 5e is super dope fun, right? And one of the reasons why is when D&D 5e scratches its butt, it crushes D&D then and D&D not's attention for anything. Like, they launch entire games that don't get the hype Dungeons and Dragons errata gets, right? So nothing in the world is making sure people remember Gary Gygax better than D&D 5e. Certainly nothing coming out of D&D not, and certainly nothing coming out of D&D then. That's clear as day to me, right? Like, it's just so shockingly clear, right? And I'm not going to join people warming their hand over a fire trash barrel, right? When there's a gigantic carnival of fun over here, right? Like, I'm not going to do it. That's my take. I'd love to hear yours. I'm losing some face here. Like, this is evidence on the D&D then side and the D&D not say, I'll take the egg on my face. You gotta take your losses when you hit them. That's my take. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.